All right, guys, we're going to get the last session before lunch started here. Up next is Jonathan Spring from Carnegie Mellon University, giving a talk entitled Prioritizing Vulnerability Response with a Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan, and all yours, sir.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Thanks. Oh, do we have feedback? We okay? Okay. I think that this is a good vulnerability, sort of management segment. So now we'll talk about, so now you're sure that you have a problem. How do you triage which ones you handle first? So there'll be a quiz on the next slide. Okay, hope you pass the test later. What we're talking about is something that's stakeholder specific for categorizing vulnerabilities. We're trying to improve some status quo things, bring some stuff together. I think it is plausible to talk about this as a kind of risk management, so I'm willing to say that word, whereas other things might not be quite fully encompassing that. The focus here is on So there'll be a quiz on the next slide. Okay, hope you pass the test later. What we're talking about is something that's stakeholder specific for categorizing vulnerabilities. We're trying to improve some status quo things, bring some stuff together. I think it is plausible to talk about this as a kind of risk management, so I'm willing to say that word, whereas other things might not be quite fully encompassing that. The focus here is on what decisions you're going to make. I'll talk more about what these are. But it's not to say like, oh, well, let's just talk about what the technical severity of the vulnerability is, and then as if that is the decision. Let's actually have you tell us what decisions you're going to make, and then help you make them. Try to be transparent. We're going to try to own that different people's roles mean that they need to make different decisions. So we're going to have to make role-specific recommendations on decisions and decision-making and what information goes into those decisions. I also have tried to talk about how we can verify that SSVC is itself consistent and useful. So we've proposed some experiment design and run, sort of an empirical case study on multiple people scoring the same vulnerability and making sure that they get the same answers and the same decision. Right, so obviously you want your analysts to make the same decision as each other and not have how you triage a vul be dependent on the random assignment to which analyst it goes to. There's been a lot of people who have helped over the last, 4 years that we've been working on this. Various conference attendees, the GitHub contributors, all of the people at CERT who are still here and also have moved on to other companies since we started. The motivation here is this communication between the risk owners, the risk managers, right, and the analysts of the vulnerabilities. The risk managers want to know what's going to happen, and the analysts want to hear that from them clearly, right? And then also the analysts want to be able to communicate clearly what they've done and why. So we proposed some decision processes for different stakeholder roles, right? So deployer of software, vendor of software, whoever produces the software, the producer, right? And also coordinators have their own specific role. There's a bunch of different kinds of coordinators. A lot of national CERTs are coordinators. They should ask different questions than people who deploy software because they know different things and they're making different decisions. We're on version 2 for this, and we're always trying to improve it. I think yesterday I was going through and trying to flag the GitHub issues that should be done to make it a version 2.1. we also are trying to provide a process to you to adapt this to your situation. And as your sort of vulnerability triage matures, you can be more specific to your situation, and we try to give you the tools to do that for yourself. And always go to our GitHub page. You can just go there now if you're bored and just look at that instead of hearing me talk in the background. That's fine, I don't super care. So here's the decisions, right? Since we're trying to tell you what priority to take on a work item, and work item is going to be a little bit different depending on your stakeholder role, right? Basically, we're proposing these. The ones for coordinators are a little bit different. But I've talked to a number of different people in CISO or manager roles, and I haven't gotten a different answer that these are the 4 tiers of what you can do, right? Don't worry about this right now. Do it during regular business processes. Make people work overtime. Call the lawyers, maybe shut everything down. This is actually really a huge problem. Ground the flights, I don't know, everything is broken. Hopefully the last one is never something you've had to do, but I think it is a real consideration. This still does not tell you what you should do about it. You know, if you're a software deployer and your action is to keep people late and there is a patch, then probably the right thing to do is apply the patch. It gets more complicated if it's a 0 day and there's no patch yet, but you have to do something now. Like, what's the mitigation that you put into place? Do you accept the risk? Do you turn it off, right? So I don't tell you exactly what to do. I do have some advice on how we can structure that discussion using some of the decision points that you would use to make the triage decision. Cool. But just for clarity, it's not like a thou shalt patch at this point because we're talking about different stakeholders. Coordinators are going to have a different set of options. Coordinators don't patch things. They maybe issue advisories. So these are the 3 main roles. These track the roles in coordinated vulnerability disclosure. If you want to read 100 pages about multi-party CVD, we also have that document, but I will not talk about it today. When I say priority of action on a work item, this is where I'm talking about, you know, if you are the supplier, you are going to produce the patch or produce some mitigation advice, right? If you are the coordinator, maybe you're going to issue an advisory. If you are the deployer, hopefully you'll have a patch to apply. But because I say work item, I'm explicitly not saying CVE ID. Right, if we tie this specifically to CVE IDs, then things like reports about misconfigurations in your web server that you receive from your bug bounty program, I can still do SSVC for those because they are vulnerabilities, but they're never going to get a CVE ID. Right, so also flexible to how you're getting these things in. I think that you know, the CVSS impact metrics are also really credible case and not worst case. But because SSVC has been talking about safety for a while, I wanted to make sure that this is clear, that this is built in. Unless you can tell me a real case where actually someone is going to get hurt, and it's like documented and deployed, and like that's the intended use, I'm not going to go sort of catastrophizing about what could happen, right? Especially because, so for example, for minor or none, this is basically the IEC 61508 categories. Yes, I've read that too many times because I have that number memorized. You know, people get hurt, or nobody's going to die, people are going to die. That's a pretty basic separation that I think that most people can make for if you're issuing software. There's other examples. You know, I think that probably, maybe if nobody dies, but the entire voting system for a state is going to collapse, that is also a pretty high human impact. We'll talk about those at about the same level of urgency. I don't tend to have a lot of images in my slides because that's not how I think, I guess, and I'm sorry. But you can, you know, I enjoy these comics occasionally. So we don't want vulnerability management to become the version of this, where either everything is a 1 or everything is a 10, because like the worst thing you can imagine is always so much worse than what's actually going on. So the sort of scoring function, we can technically call it a function because I can turn this into binary algebra. We're not going to go through that. It's just logic. It's fine. You answer some questions, and you sort of decide ahead of time what you're going to do given the situation represented by those 4 questions, 5 questions, whatever. So you might say that if the state of exploitation of the vulnerability is that there is a public proof of concept and it's integrated into Metasploit, and also that the utility to the adversary is that it's hard for them to use, and also technical impact, and also the public safety impact, and this, and this, and this, and this, then respond in a scheduled way. Like your priority is to do it on the normal schedule, right? So we're just gonna have a number of different combinations of these possible question answers, metric values, decision point values. Officially in the documentation, they're decision points, right? So how many of these do we end up with? You might think that it's going to be way too many to try to individually specify each situation. Well, if it's too many to individually specify each situation, ask fewer questions. Because then you're trying to gather too much information, it's not going to make a difference. So for example, if you're a software supplier, this is the sort of suggested default tree that we say you might want to use for version 2. I don't remember exactly, but I think there's 36 different situations. So that looks scary, but then that's everything you could possibly do. That's all of the possible combinations. There's a little bit of hiding there in that I think one of those might be a sort of or of a couple of things, but relatively easy. The analyst has to answer 5 questions. You get a result. This lets you also see like how many things are red, like for active exploitation, which is the first one there. I know you can't read it, but trust me. It makes everything sort of red towards that bottom of the chart because if you're a supplier and things are actively being exploited, that's a 0 day. And you're going to keep people late for those, basically. Also, if you don't agree with me, just change the edges. If you want to not act on a 0 day because it's not important if everything else is low, fine. Change that orange one to a green one. I don't care. It's your risk, right? So this is sort of the view that the leadership or risk manager should be able to take, right? This tree sort of summarizes the risk posture of the organization. The analyst doesn't need to keep the whole tree in mind. They just need to know what questions to ask. So we have different decision points for different roles. I think that should be sort of obvious, right? Vendors know different things than suppliers. Suppliers know different things than deployers. Some of them are going to be shared. Right? So the supplier knows, or I recommend that the supplier can answer these 4 or 5 questions. The deployer can answer these and are useful to answer these. I think that maybe this actually is a little bit too many, and I'm going to try to get rid of one of them in the version 2.1 release, but we're going to see how that goes. You might notice that these are the same. These 2 things are very good candidates for the supplier to put into their security advisory because they can tell all of the people who deploy the system what the answer is. The answer won't change. Some of these things are not the same. It seems pretty obvious that the person who makes the software can't know how you're going to deploy it. They won't know what the exposure of the system is to the internet. Only the deployer knows that. So we will not ask the supplier to know that. However, it probably matters a lot to how quickly you need to patch a piece of software if it's exposed and open to the internet. So we'll have the deployer ask that. Some of these things are related, right? One of the pieces of feedback from, I think it was VMware, was that they don't know that much about how their software is deployed, right? I mean, VMware in particular knows that it's not supposed to be used for anything that's going to kill people. But so public safety impact only really has people will die, people will not die, right? The situated safety impact, you might know a little bit more about well, this PLC is deployed in the robotic arm that can reach people. whereas the other ones are not. If you are growing bored of listening to me describe these things to you and you want to move at your own pace, you can go look at this page here. I will also continue to talk through things. Choose your own adventure. So this is the full definition for one of the decision points. This one in particular is the state of exploitation. Right, so the first sentence tries to give you like a pretty concise summary of what we're trying to talk about with this one. Present state of exploitation. Then we try to give some context, some stuff that might be interesting, some stuff that might be involved, right? But really the key thing is that the analyst is going to have to decide between these three states of affairs. There's no clear evidence of exploitation, there's a public proof of concept, or it's actively being exploited. You might then ask, what do those mean? Well, some of them are relatively simple answers. I think the right default for this is, I've looked in all the regular places for active exploitation, like my IDS alerts are not triggering and I have signatures installed, it's not on the known exploited vulnerabilities list, right? I pay for a threat intelligence feed and it's not on there. Okay, I've looked in those three places, it's not active. POC also decidable, right? Have you looked in the right places? Maybe you're just going to decide that looking on the underground markets isn't something you're willing to pay for, that doesn't matter, so you've just done the other two. Metasploit and exploit DB are public. They tag things with CVE IDs. You can search those repositories. We have code available that does that. You can automate that part of this. There might be some things that are CWE related that maybe you're never going to see public POCs like that because it's just configure the squid proxy to do a certain thing for an on-path attacker. Whatever, fine. There's a couple of different ways you can get to POC. But you can check that these have happened, and if they haven't, then you pick none. So there's no default for this one. There's do the work, do the checking, you didn't find anything, call it none. You can always answer this. So the deployer tree looks a little bit scarier. I had to shrink that down to whatever, 2-point font to get it onto the slide, maybe 4-point, but it fits. This looks scary, right? But of course, it's easy to automate just a and B and C and D. It's just a lookup table. Very simple, 4 lines of code, right? Automating the human has decided that these are the 4 answers, therefore scheduled, super easy. The cognitive processing task of figuring out what the answer to technical severity is a little bit harder, right? But we've designed this to try to minimize this human effort because the humans are going to have to do some of it. So some of these are reusable across device. And also I think exposure particularly is actually probably viably the result of an SS scan. Like define some different scan points for your different scanners. If it responds to these different scans, then it's open. If it doesn't respond to these but responds to those, it's controlled, right? It would be plausible to automate that. And then it's an asset management thing. You don't have to do it for each vulnerability. It's fine. The whole process of setting up the tree is also reusable, right? So you don't have to do this every time. And as I sort of mentioned, I think some of these are actually automatable. Conveniently, state of exploitation is probably the one that you want to update the most often. You might want to update that every day. But checking the GitHub repositories for the exploit DB and Metasploit and other GitHub scans and whatever, checking the kev list, those are all automatable. So the thing that needs to change the most often is also, conveniently, the thing that's easiest to automate. Okay, we will now go through a scoring example. So here's a Rockwell vol. To be honest, I haven't wanted to update the example because I want to try to be consistent. So this is 2 years old now. But this had a base score of 9.8. People were sort of cranky about that because it doesn't really make sense that this is that important. But here we are. So how do we score this? Well, it is a remote code execution, right? So you're going to get total control. Technical impact is total. I think that there's a gloss, possibly of like, if CVSS version 3 scope is unchanged and C is high and I is high, then total. Maybe. I think that's not quite right. Or at least the scope thing makes it a little bit messy, but fine. Well, is this one currently being exploited? Last time I checked, no, which was recently, but things could have changed. But normally something has a public proof of concept within 2 or 3 days, if it's going to get one. This is now 2 years old. The chances that this changes day on day is pretty low. So this one is, utility is this concept of how useful it is to the adversary. To make this easier to see in the tree, we sort of compress this as like, either it's very good for them, but hard to do, or it's very easy for them to do, but it doesn't matter very much. We've given those the same label of efficient. Right? We could redo the trees to make automatable and value density explicit and just make sure that whenever those two, yes or diffuse and no and concentrated, we can make sure that those just always have the same answer, but it's easier to manage that cognitive load if you condense them here. So we'll just go through those 2 questions like the analyst would do. So first question the analyst would ask is it automatable? We frame this in the kill chain way. So this one really has 4 subparts. Can I automate step 1, reconnaissance? Can I automate step 2? Right. By the way, if there's remote code execution possible, it almost certainly is automatable, because that's sort of what remote code execution means. Unauthenticated remote code execution, I guess, right? How important is this thing to the attacker? Like, are they going to really care about it because they get a lot of value out of it? Or do they need to compromise a lot of them and turn them into a botnet to resell 100,000 bots at a time for it to be worth their time? This one is the second one. They will still do that, but it's not like compromising an Active Directory server, right? Okay, so yes, but diffuse, so we're going to collapse that to efficient. This could change, obviously. I said that the supplier doesn't know the exposure, but this is supposed to be, factory talk thing is supposed to be at least not open to the internet. You could check Shodan, see how many of them are open to the internet, and those people should set this to open until they fix that, and then they can change it. But smaller control depending on exactly how you deployed your ICS network, right? Can people die from this? It's the diagnostics page. It shouldn't kill anybody. I'm sure that you could invent a situation in which it killed people. I don't care if you can invent that. Show it to me, deployed on the factory floor, and then we'll talk to those people who deployed it that way. Okay, is your plant going to shut down because the diagnostics page has a remote code execution vulnerability in it? Even if it's exploited, like assuming they get to it, right? I hope not. You might lose visibility into stuff that's going on, but it shouldn't be able to directly control the systems that are reporting to it. It should be like sort of a write-only diagnostics page, right? Okay, so different stakeholders will use different pieces of that information. But here's the summary of the 7 questions we just went through. I think maybe 6 or 7 minutes. I knew some of the answers, so it was a little bit faster than normal. But I think an analyst should be able to answer those questions in less than 20 minutes. Because we can give them advice on where to look, right? We can structure that question answering process, because the questions are sort of small and they have relatively coarse answers. You don't have to get into excessive amounts of detail that don't matter. Based on the default trees that we recommend, the deployer would actually defer on this. Compare that to the base score of 9.8. I don't think you would get that 9.8 down to a low using the environmental and temporal metrics. Rockwell should definitely produce a patch, which they obviously did. So it seems like we all agree there. Just so you can see how sort of this flows through the supplier tree, I've highlighted the answers there and then how you get to the end. We can also bring back the, none and efficient and partial and minimal equals scheduled, right? This is sort of just a logical combination of those 4 answers to get you to the edge of the tree. Cool, that's it. I mean, there's obviously lots of details on how you implement this, but that's it, right? That's all you would need to really know. There's 70 more pages of documentation if you want to get into the details. If you think that we've forgotten something, file an issue on the GitHub, and we will answer it. Better, file an issue and then a pull request, and fix it yourself. Right? We've gotten a bunch of people to give us different public comments. If you don't want to do it on GitHub, I will take emails and fix it myself and then not tell anyone who told me. That happened earlier this week. I want to do more studies about making sure that this works, especially across sort of non-US centric or maybe non-English as a first language people reading the spec and the expectations and getting the same answers. So if you'd like to volunteer, let me know. This is everything I've told you. Right, so I think that stakeholder specific thing I take very seriously, right? Like different stakeholders are going to have different importance, right? Different things that they bring to the table, different requirements. You know, the last thing I'll say is that I think, you know, one legitimate but perhaps unfortunate decision process is my national CERT told me to. We can also represent that in SSVC. Question 1, did your national CERT tell you to? Yes, patch it. No, don't. But then you might want to know how your national CERT came to that decision so that if you do want to start to mature your process, you can start to include some of your own information into it. There will also be a BOF at 5. Please come talk to us and complain, or tell us we're great. I would like the second, but I really need the first more. As a reward for questions, the best question can have a signed copy of this book. I'll move it up here for you to all see that. There you go. Yeah, so I'm almost exactly where I wanted to be to leave 9 minutes for questions. So if no one asks a question, then no one gets the book. Thanks.
Not really looking for the book. Also, it's appreciated as an incentive. But I was wondering, when you reference a CV, so you actually bind the SSVC score or metrics to any kind of ID. Have you considered using the VRDX format that is developed at a first SIG?
Yes, in the sense that I'm agnostic. Or like so by saying work item, it can be whatever sort of ID you want to bind it to. I think that there are different use cases for different ones. So I certainly don't want to be tied to using just one, because not everything is going to fall under one identifier system, I don't think, unless you have the one ring to rule them all.
No, I don't.
So yeah, I think that that's also a good one to use. I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to bind it to a VRDX. CVEIDs, you know, I sort of alluded to this when I said that there are certain things that the supplier and the deployer could profitably communicate to each other. Right, so like state of exploitation, I think makes sense to bind to a CVEID as well as other things. But like exposure, I don't think makes sense to bind so much to a CVEID publicly, like in the NVD, because it's going to change per deployment. So different decision points I would bind differently, I think.
And my second question would be, are there already tools available to do that on scale? So if I want to, so you showed a great demo tool, but if I want to do that in practice for all of the security advisories that come in, is there a tool I can do that with, where also then automatically can update the exploit notification or the exploit decision?
So there's JSON for SSVC. The demo CERT calculator will output JSON for you. Will CSAF take in SSVC JSON?
Probably not at that stage, but we can discuss that for 2.1.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So based on what you scored that you were talking about with CVSS, so I'm assuming that's based on what comes out from the vendor?
Sorry, which part of?
Oh, you were talking about, like you were showing the CVSS 9.8. Like, so I'm assuming that's based on the vendor version of the CVSS score and not based off of if you go through the whole process and actually figure it out how it's really the score as it's set up in your own organization, correct?
So if you mean, is it the base score and not the base environmental temporal score, then the 9.8 is the base score.
Yeah.
The temporal score could potentially be used to represent the fact that there's no exploitation, and that would bring it down, I don't have the equation memorized, but to something like an 8 point something. And then the environmental metrics, you could potentially say that the sort of security requirements are medium, but that will keep the score flat. It's security requirements high in version 3 that will increase the score. And if you change the modified impact metrics for CIA, that won't really change the score in particular because you get total control. It's an RCE, right? The environmental thing won't help you there. So I think that you could use the base environmental temporal score to change it from a 9.8 to maybe an 8 or something, but that's still a high.
So I guess mainly I'm just thinking about for any time you would be using this, it's like if you went through whatever process you did for whatever, irregardless of the CVE, and you said, okay, for the CVSS score, as I have it implemented here, I have it, how would you recommend, or if we used SSVC, how would we coordinate those two scores to help us?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing you'd need is to say what decisions you make based on what CVSS scores, right? You could do that, and then probably it would be okay. I think that there's some things in SSVC version 2 that are not representable in CVSS v3. Like mission or safety impact, just not accessible. Exposure is maybe representable in that you could change the attack vector, but that's not in the environmental metrics. You're not really supposed to be allowed to touch that as a deployer, right? So there are things that CVSS sort of doesn't recommend you're able to change that are clearly in the control of the deployer for SSVC, right? And there are some things in SSVC that just aren't represented in CVSS v3. But I think that if your question is like, okay, so I'm already using CVSS at least according to the spec exactly, and I'm actually doing environmental and temporal scores, like good. That is definitely better than just using the base score. And just using the base score is explicitly forbidden. So, but people still do it all the time.
All right. Thanks.
So you walked us through one of the examples during your presentation. But then if you go through this within an organization, you really want to record all of your decisions and the evidence that you had for these decisions. Do you envision any tools that would support that?
It depends on what form the evidence needs to take. If it's a URL, the JSON can, encode a URL on a timestamp, use the Wayback Machine, whatever. For things like automatable, it's a bit harder because it's sort of an argument, right? There is a fair amount of work talking about argumentation and like what makes a good argument, even in security specifically. Some of the very challenging ones to provide evidence for are still going to be sort of intelligence analysis or human, right? It's not an NLP task that I expect a machine learning thing to be able to pick up next year. And that'll have to be, to some extent, just exposed as text for us to argue about for something that's complicated. For when it's system exposure, You know, I think that probably the scan results should be attached to your internal documentation with a timestamp. And, you know, we need to make space for that, but I think that's relatively straightforward. Is that your question?
Yeah, I didn't mean that it was going to be a fully automated decision, but basically, if you're going through this, there's a human looking at this and making decisions, and you need to record that.
Yes. And I would say that also one of the things that ought to be done is, as long as you have at least 2 analysts, you should randomly assign like 10% of your vols to both of them and make sure that they get the same answer. And if they don't, I think it's probably a problem with the spec and not a problem with the analysts. Like, I want to know about it, not that you should discipline the analysts. But that's how we're going to keep making sure that everything works properly, is if we document the decisions and occasionally are comparing them for the same answers and making sure we're getting the same humans, getting the humans to give us the same answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, also, in case this isn't obvious, people are really using this in practice, and it is working for people. This is based on a bunch of refinement that we've gotten from stuff, operations, you know, in practice. Some of those organizations haven't made it public. You know, talk to Jay if you have questions about how that's working in practice. I think I'm right on time, and I will not stop you from getting to lunch.